So I'll start over again. The topic of today's lesson is love, and I think it's misleading because, and as we'll see as we get into this, it's hard to imagine that you might at some point wish that the word love was missing from a place in the Bible. But I'm going to point one out to you that I think the word love, if it had been left out, would have made a huge change in the way the world operates. And we'll see. You'll see what I mean when we get to that. But the basic theme here is love. Okay, and not that love is a bad thing, just the way it happens to be placed in one particular verse, seems to create confusion and I think cause trouble. So we'll see how I'll get your opinions on that as we get into it. So we're talking about Ephesians 5 verses 21 to 23. And as I said, love sounds like an innocuous topic. It's sort of like motherhood and apple pie from a Christian perspective. But we're going to see that today's lesson has the potential to make love be a little bit controversial. And I'll be interested to know if any of you have any issues with today's text as we get into that topic. So we're going to start by reading the text. And I believe if I have these slides the way I think I do, that we'll see it in chunks as we go through this. So I'm going to see if someone would be happy to read this. Okay, so Tony's going to read.
Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they fed and care for their bodies, just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you also must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband.
So does anyone take issue with anything in that passage?
Why must the wife respect the husband and not love the husband?
Good question.
Those days they didn't have love. They just united them as from different families. So maybe that's why they put that in. But I would say respect and love are the same thing.
You mean arranged marriages?
Right.
Yes.
The controversy for me is the husband is the head of the wife.
Well, another thing, in those days, the men worked and made the money. The women stayed home, made bread, watched the kids, fed the homes, the stock outside. So it's put into those words. But I think it just means that you should love one another. You should be together. You should be as one. I don't think it, in those days, that's probably how they,
So you think it's cultural?
Yes, definitely.
It goes back to the slave issue too. Treat your slaves as you would treat yourself. In those days, they had slaves.
Any other thoughts? Betty's being very quiet over there.
We know Betty's.
I don't need to say anything. You know how I feel about it. I don't like that submit word.
Well,
That submit word.
She doesn't, and that's a fact. Okay.
Yeah, the thing about the fiddler on the roof, the older Jewish generation, it was the wife that ran that. I mean, Tevye was subservient to his wife. So I don't think this
Well, it turns out, so from the work that I did in reading commentaries and so forth, and I do have to thank Pastor Knott for this too, because I spoke with him about this after the last class, I guess 2 weeks ago now. And he gave me some insight, which I will be sharing. So there's three different ways to look at this passage. Okay, and the church and various denominations and various churches have taken all three perspectives. The first approach is to accept it literally as timeless truth, applicable today to us as it ever was. The husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is head of the church. Wives should submit to their husbands in everything. And while this gives husbands authority, they're not to abuse it, loving their wives as they love themselves. That's the literal interpretation. And if you take it literally and you think it's timeless, then you would get to the point where you're saying the man's in charge, wives have to do what the man says and submit themselves. Okay, that's interpretation number one. Okay, and it's a fairly common interpretation, particularly among the more conservative denominations. Okay, the second approach is the one I like best, and that's to interpret. And I should say, before I get into this, I should say that whoever makes the schedule for these classes assigns people to various topics, and usually I'm the one who makes the schedule. And although we've taught Ephesians probably 4 or 5 times over the many years that we've been having this adult ed class, I always manage to give this passage to Chuck. So I think this is the first time that I've actually been the one responsible for teaching it. But a lot of what I'm going to say comes from Chuck. And Chuck was much better at explaining this than I think I'll end up being. So we'll see. But anyway, the second view is to interpret it as a bilateral command for us to love and submit to each other. And if you go back and look, you'll see that the opening line, the first verse, verse 21, simply says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And I think that's the part that you need to really hang your hat on. If we dig a little deeper into this interpretation, this is what Pastor Knott pointed out to me 2 weeks ago. In the Greek, verse 22 does not have the word submit. It's not there. It's called an elided verb. That's another word I don't use very much. In fact, never. But it comes out, every once in a while in these classes, I come up with one of these interesting words. Elided. It means that the sentence has no verb. It simply says wives to their husbands. Okay. And an elided verb inherits its meaning from what comes before. So what comes before is submit yourselves to one another, and then wives to your husbands. Okay, think about that for a minute. Doesn't that give it a different sound? Submit yourself to one another, wives to your husbands.
If you had and husbands to wives.
Right, and that's
implied.
Now we're getting to where I said the word love in one verse has twisted around the whole way that this thing is looked at. Because if it simply left out the word love in that first verse referring to the husbands and says husbands to your wives, okay, then you would have submit yourselves one to another, wives to your husbands, husbands to your wives. And then it elaborates in both cases slightly differently, okay, talking about the relationship of the church to Christ. Okay, and so it uses that submission of a couple to one another. In the section about wives, it uses it to talk about obedience. And in the section about husbands, it uses it to talk about love. But what it's really saying is we should submit to one another. Okay, we should obey one another, and we should obey Christ. Just the the relationship between the wife and the husband should be one of mutual obedience, just as our relationship with Jesus is a relationship of obedience, and our relationship to one another should be a relationship of love, just as our relationship to Christ is supposed to be a relationship of love. So the way that this has been looked at through the centuries may not really reflect what Paul was really saying.
Stanley calls marriage a submission competition.
So the third interpretation is what I think Tony was getting at, which is to view it as applicable to the culture of the time and not now. So I don't particularly like that interpretation because it says, well, why read it then? Okay, and it does have something to say to us. And if you remember how somebody look back and read that last little bit of it, starting with "This is a mystery."
This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband.
So he says, what I'm really talking about here is the relationship between Christ and the church. I'm not really talking about husbands and wives at all. I'm just using the relationship between husbands and wives to illustrate what the relationship of Christ to the church should be. Okay, and then
Like the two will become one flesh, completely melded. Church.
yeah, maybe that.
Yeah, I think the church and have become one with God.
Okay, so what do you think? That's another homage to Chuck. After all that we just talked about, what viewpoints do you have now about this?
I still stick with that one.
You still think it's cultural?
I think you could change the words respect, love, and submit anywhere in here. You know, they all kind of mean the same thing.
Well, submit has other overtones
Yeah.
of power.
Yeah, and I mean, look, the way it's largely been interpreted through the centuries has been submission for the wife. The man is the head of the household. I've certainly heard sermons about that, even here in this church, not lately, but going back, 30, 40 years, you would hear that here. Okay. And I definitely heard it in the Baptist church I grew up in, so some churches are still kind of that way. They don't allow women to be elders. They don't allow women to be ministers. They don't allow women to teach men. Depending on how conservative the church is, they can go pretty far in terms of, and it's based on verses like these, that that we really need to take a fresh look at.
I think they should have new Bibles saying it the old way, but having a little mark there and interpreting it the way we're interpreting it.
Yeah, I know Russ reads from the Message.
But do they tell you what this means like he's telling us? Or just...
Well, everyone could write their own version of what they think this means, so most of the Bibles I've seen that are like that tend to present the conservative perspective. And you do have to be really careful, because I was trying to, honestly, I was looking for something like what you're talking about. As I was preparing for this lesson, I went in to one of those Bible websites and I looked at every single translation that they had there. And they all,
You submit.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, they all had this notion of submission in them. None of them did what If I were going to write my own paraphrase, I wouldn't write it with submit like that.
So we have to have Pastor Conley write a new.
Well, we'll get. I'm hoping he'll walk in here pretty soon and chime in on this. But it's the problem is that it's too easy to get bound up in the issue of husbands and wives when you read this passage.
Literally doesn't sound right.
Right. You have to be careful.
Right. So, I mean, the only way really a person can understand it is to go to classes or, go online and try to find out, other interpretations of it. Because people stick to it so strictly that it's just, the Bible says this, and that's what.
Yeah, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. That's it. I was taught that phrase as a kid. That wasn't meant to be, that wasn't something that you'd be critical of. That was what I was taught.
That's what Pastor Nunn has taught us, that translations mean everything. How do you interpret this? In the Greek, it's not there.
Right.
So it shifts the whole thing.
Yeah, that one word that's not in the Greek, that's been inserted in all the English translations, really shades the way we view these verses. And like I said, I wish that in that first verse pertaining to husbands, it had just left the word love out. And if the word love weren't there, I think we'd all read it differently. If the word submit weren't there with the wives, which it's not, and the word love weren't there with the husbands, which it is, then we'd see it as a bilateral command, with giving everybody equal status, and we would understand that the rest of it is just elaborating on the relationship between Christ and the church. But I don't want to get too tied up in that. So the bottom line here is we should submit to one another as to the Lord. We should love one another as Christ loves us. We should love one another as we love our own bodies. Okay, and we should apply those phrases which are in there, scattered around in the passage that was just read. We should apply all three of those phrases equally to the husband and to the wife, as the basis of a good marital relationship. But also, we need to apply those phrases to the relationship between Christ and the church. We've all grown up with this. We've all heard probably sermons on it. We've all studied it in class from time to time. And we probably don't realize how revolutionary this was when Paul wrote it. That gets back to what Tony was kind of saying before, because our view of marriage is the Christian view of marriage that's kind of expressed in this passage is widely accepted in the United States now, even by people that aren't Christians or, have no Christian foundation even. Marriage is regarded as a union of body, mind, and spirit, soulmates, people will say. And usually the ideal concept is a bilateral agreement where you work together to accomplish things and you support each other. Okay, and boy, as I was driving around the room at the inn, people, if you lose half of that support, that's really makes life difficult for a family. Betty and I have been remarkably fortunate in our lives to have had each other the whole time and to have been able to raise 3 kids in a family that had a strong relationship between Betty and me. And so far, that seems to be working out for our children as well. So our 7 grandchildren are all being raised by parents that work together to raise them and are being relatively successful at doing that. I hope none of that falls apart. I don't think it will, but that would be awful. But when I see what happens, we have a dad here with 2 little boys, no wife in the picture. Okay. We have a mom here with a little boy and a little girl, and the little girl has Down syndrome and is a real challenge behaviorally. And this poor mom, she seems relatively young, struggling to cope with this. I worry about the future of both of those families and all four of those children, and part of the problem is that they aren't growing up in a family that has this type of a relationship. So I don't think we can overemphasize how important the bilateral nature of a Christian marriage is to the upbringing of successful upbringing of families, and the cooperation of two parents to be able to pull that off. It's enough of a struggle, I mean, all of us, I don't know everybody here, but a lot of us have several children, and we know what it was like trying to bring up those children. Betty and I thought we were running a taxi cab service there for a while, just to get the kids to all the places they needed to be. And, one of us could take care of one thing and the other could take care of another, and that would work out. But if there were just one person, that would really be tough. Really would be tough. But back in those days, as Tony was pointing out, that wasn't how things were. The passage sets forth an ideal that had the commentator said had a radiant purity in an immoral world. Things were bad among the Jews, worse among the Gentiles, and absolutely horrible in Rome at the time. So let's look a little at what married life was like for the Jewish community in Paul's time. Theoretically, the Jews had a high ideal of marriage. They they wanted people to be married. They wanted married couples. But the rabbis said Jews should die rather than commit idolatry, murder, or adultery. So adultery was right up there with idolatry and murder in terms of sin. But they had a low view of women. Men thanked God when they prayed that they weren't made a Gentile, a slave, or a woman. A woman was her husband's possession, had no legal rights.
Not nowadays. It's changed.
The divorce laws were singularly one-sided. In Deuteronomy, it says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, he writes her a bill of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house. That's all it would take. Something I didn't like about you, I can say, you're gone. You're fired.
Islam, they can say, I divorce you 3 times.
Hillel, an important rabbi, Hillel, interpreted that to mean that a man could divorce his wife if she spoiled his dinner by putting too much salt in it.
Was it that severe? I mean, that bad?
That's what Hillel said. The rabbi said that's what it meant. Yeah. Too much salt in your dinner. You don't like that? You can say, I'm divorcing you. Akiba said a husband could divorce his wife if found a woman who considered more attractive. And the only condition was that the woman's dowry needed to be returned to her parents. Yeah, dad gets a refund if I kick you out. A woman could not divorce her husband. That was strictly one-sided.
Children? What you say?
I don't know. I would sort of get, I don't know. Really don't know.
Children always went with the mother. I mean, there was a thing, in the Jewish religion that if you have kids or whatever it is, it has to be what the mother is. So if the mother's Jewish and she marries somebody who is a Gentile, the kids have to be what the mother is. So I assume that would give the kids to the mother.
I don't know, because, the father would feel that his sons were very important. He might give her the girls.
I'm sure he would.
I mean, that would be a reason for divorce, is she didn't bear you a son. So I don't know.
What happened to King Henry VIII?
Yes.
Yeah.
He went through what, 6 wives?
So in the Greek world, it was even worse than in the Jewish world, because prostitution was an accepted part of life. Demosthenes said, "We have courtesans for the sake of pleasure, concubines for the sake of daily cohabitation, and wives for the purpose of having children." Companionship and fellowship in marriage was impossible. The Greek expected his wife to run the home and care for the kids, but he found pleasure and companionship elsewhere. So bad for the Jews, worse for the Greeks. Respectable women led a secluded life, no part in public life. They were never on the streets alone. They never appeared at meals or at social occasions. Has that ever hung over in any of your families?
I know my mother, when she was very young, I know that when she got a job, my grandfather used to walk her to the bus stop. He wasn't allowed to walk alone. She's not Jewish.
That was just protected, don't you think? No.
Well, the man is protected. Not my grandmother never walked her, just my grandfather always.
My mom drove a car, and in her generation, although plenty of women drove cars, there were plenty who did not. And even the ones that did were very hesitant about it. My mom benefited from that because she got a lot of invitations to go to the beach with friends who had shore houses and wouldn't drive to the shore. You know, so they would get my mom to drive to, say, invite my mom to go to the shore for several days and stay at their place, and she would drive. So mom had a number of friends that did that, and she got a lot of beach time as a result of being willing to drive from here to Ocean City when most of her friends wouldn't, and some of them didn't even have cars. And we probably all remember a time when the family only had one car, and the father would be the one that mostly used it. I think there's still cultures, even in our community, where a woman will serve a meal to a gathering of people and not partake. Will stand aside and serve them as they eat it. Maybe mostly in Asian families, but that's not unheard of even now. The woman had her own apartments. None but her husband could go in there. So she was very secluded. And Xenophon said that she would see as little as possible, hear as little as possible, and ask as little as possible. That was the life of a woman in Greek society. There was no legal procedure for divorce in Greece. So in Greece, home and family life were nearly extinct, and fidelity was completely non-existent. So this is and then there's Rome. We're going to get to Rome here. In Rome, family life had degenerated completely. For the first 500 years of the Republic, there had not been one case of divorce, but that had changed. And by the time of Paul, Roman family life was wrecked. Seneca wrote, "Women are married to be divorced and divorced to be married." He said, "Women mark the time by the name of their husbands." Jerome wrote of a woman who was married to her 23rd husband and was his 21st wife. And many other writers provided similar accounts. So this is the world, that the Jewish world was the best of the three, and the Roman world was the worst of the three, but this cosmopolitan community in the places like Ephesus where Paul was going had this mixture of Jews, Romans, and Greeks, and their family lives were like what we're reading here. So when Paul writes, "Husbands, love your wives as God loves the church," okay, that was a stretch. That was new. That was different. That wasn't expected. Back to Rome. I've had another page of Rome. Caesar Augustus demanded Livia's husband divorce her when she was with child so that he could marry her himself. Cicero put away his wife to marry a young heiress. Suetonius told of a lady called Melonia who committed suicide rather than submit to the favors of Tiberius the emperor. And the whole atmosphere was adulterous. The marriage bond was on the way to complete breakdown. There was a TV series back in the 1980s, I think, called I, Claudius. If you ever watch that, you'll see all this stuff. You know, it doesn't depict any love between any couple. They're all, just after political ends or something like that, and they're poisoning each other and, so on. That's a duplicate.
Many Romans became Christian. Plus you had to obey one.
So the views in this passage were not widely held, and he was calling men and women to a new purity. He sought a new fellowship in the married life, and it's impossible to exaggerate the cleansing effect that Christianity had on home life in the ancient world and the benefits it brought to the world and to women. Yeah. Yeah, the vestiges of it. I mean, our whole culture is really fundamentally founded in Christian principle. Even people who say they're atheists and have never read the Bible, most of their views on morality and what's right and what's wrong all have their foundations in Christianity. And it is the American culture, like it or not. And other parts of the world don't share all those same values, which is another thing that's hard for us to understand when we start to form opinions on world politics and so forth, because people in other countries aren't going to look at things the same way Americans do. And a lot of that is Western civilization's Christian foundations. So many of the values we take for granted are originated with Christ and his followers. So Paul wrote some puzzling things about marriage, and we may wish he'd never written them. So some examples of that are in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So I'll point out a couple of those. In 1 Corinthians 7:2, Paul wrote, "It's good for a man not to marry. But since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband." So that's a puzzling verse. I think it is. I think it's at least the defense for celibacy among the priesthood. But it really raises more questions about Paul as far as I'm concerned. He also apparently viewed domestic life as a hindrance to the work of the church. He said, "What I mean, brothers, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they had none." And what he's basically telling the church leadership is, put your family aside and focus on the church, the work of the church.
They were expecting the end of the world every day, though.
Yeah, that's true. Although, that's true. You're right, especially when he wrote 1 Corinthians. And that I think I'm going to bring this out on maybe on this page or on another page. But 1 Corinthians was written considerably earlier than Ephesians was. So what's in Ephesians is a more experienced view of the world that Paul's expressing. He learns. We all evolve as time goes by, and Paul is learning things as he goes. He would prefer the unmarried and the widows not to marry at all. He said a widow may marry again, but it would be best to remain single. So these three verses that I just pointed out, they sort of leave you scratching your head, don't they?
But he says at the end, of 29, 30, I guess, 31. For this world in its present form is passing away. That's
Right.
why he wants everyone to prepare for this.
Right. That's true.
Things are changing.
Yeah, and that's what Barclay says in the commentary too. He attributes the passage to the fact that for Paul, the second coming of Christ was imminent. So why undertake any earthly ties? Okay, and then by the time he got around,
Also in those days, didn't the older brother would take care of the
With you.
family so that they would be able to eat and thrive? Or somebody, a relative of the husband's, say that, it didn't apply to that, only if they did.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure that's particularly relevant to the words here, but
But I'm saying maybe that's why he said you should stay
Well, we were talking
unmarried.
about marriage and why it should be dissolved.
we're on Ephesians chapter 5, verses 21 to 33, which you and I talked about before. And I explained what an elided verb is to them already.
Well, anytime you want me to jump in, I can, but I'm interested in what you all think about.
We sort of passed the difficult part,
I'm
and
peace with it then, about submission. We should all be fine with submission.
are you guys all fine?
That wasn't in the original
Well,
Greek.
no. It is there, it's just not that verse about the wives. It's in the previous verse covering all the relationship, and that's
All relation.
that's right. In other words, all relationships should be subsumed under the idea that we're submitting to Christ.
Right.
And that's why we submit to each other, through submitting to Christ. But it's a kind of even a logical pattern or argument that's being laid out. But that translation in English Bibles, that misses the big picture of submission because it focuses on just the wives.
Right.
And that was not in the Greek. But there's a lot more to be said here about that. But submission to Christ, in fact, Islam is the one that knows this best in our world. Because Islam means submission. Islam. And that's the idea. Thy will be done, that's what submission means. Submito is Latin for throwing under. So we submit our cares and problems to God's providence and so forth. So the idea of submission that we take it so negatively, especially in passages like this, when it's not in the Greek, and we fight against it, we should actually go towards submission. The question is, to whom and to what are you submitting? We submit to good laws, but we don't want to submit to bad laws.
Yeah, but he's talking about marriage now.
Right.
So if you both submit, not just the wife,
To Christ.
to Christ, you should act as your marriage as you would
Right.
to Christ. So in other words, submission is really not a bad word. It's
Well,
just,
isn't that not in that text at all?
no, not.
In fact, it's very countercultural and subversive in the Roman Empire. Because women were property, you see.
Yeah.
And that text actually gives women agency. Women not only can, but say, you should do this. And in fact, men are required to do things that the Roman Empire would be shocked at. What do you mean? Love our wives as our own body? They're our property. This is an amazingly liberating text in the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago. We don't understand it because we're post-feminist 21st century, and we read it from our perspective. We have to go into that world. This would have been so liberating, and women would have been suggesting, wait a minute, you can't do that. So, oh, yes, you can, because you and your husband are both submitting to Christ. And so the text says, to husbands or men, Christ is the head of the church, and just as Christ loved the church, you must love the wife as your own body. No Roman citizen would have understood that. No, we do with women what we want. We don't submit to Christ or even the emperor in their God. So there's a subversion in this text that we miss because we're post-modern 21st century America. So I don't know if that's something that was covered already, but so submission, we have to rehabilitate the word submission. It's just a neutral word, means to send, nito, submit, send under. And we're submitting our will, sending our will under Christ's head. And so this is talk about wild things in the Roman Empire. Slaves and masters were worshiping in the same congregation, as we know from the New Testament. And none of it says get rid of slavery. So wait a minute, why didn't they do that? Because that was not the issue. The issue was both slaves and masters knowing that they have a common master. And you read that in the text. Submission to that. And when you submit to that master, this submission is almost automatic. So you have to be willing to submit. As a soldier takes an oath in the Roman Empire, it's called sacramentum in Latin, from which you get sacrament. You take an oath, you give your life for the emperor and the empire. You submit to the will of the emperor. Even if the emperor says to do something you know is wrong. And we don't like that necessarily, but the military has these kinds of chain of command. And there are only certain areas where you could challenge that. But if every soldier challenged every command that came down, you couldn't have a military that functioned. And so the Roman Empire was structured in such a way that functioned in a particular way with a hierarchy, and men were above women, of course. And I hope this is not rehashing too many things that
We did cover most of that already.
So submission actually, if we could do it in church, is a positive thing. It's what we want to do to God's will. And if we do that, relationships between men and women kind of will start to work out no matter what generation we're in. I can't imagine 100 years ago when women did not have the rights that they had in the United States or anywhere, that those who understood this common submission of wives and husbands would mistreat each other or abuse these texts, you're supposed to submit to me. What husband would say that if he read the next paragraph? Because he has to submit to Christ. So it's just it's a wonderful text, challenging. We do have to relearn the language of the first letter in the Empire of Rome, where this language had to be, for us, a positive, liberating one, not a oppressive one.
So
anyway.
So we jumped from that back in time to the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 7.
Right.
And we hit
Wonderful.
And we hit 3 verses that are puzzling about the relationship between, about familiar relationships.
Yeah.
The one that says it's good for a man not to marry, but since there's so much immorality, every man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. Yeah. He said, what I mean, brothers, is that time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they had none. And a widow may marry again, but it would be best for her to remain single. Okay. Barclay said that should be attributed to the idea that Paul thought the second coming was any second, and not to get too involved in things of the world. But now we've caught up to where we are. It's possible the passage was colored by Paul's personal experiences. One qualification, as we know, Paul was a member of the Sanhedrin, and one qualification to be a member of the Sanhedrin was that you had to be married. But yet there is never any real mention of Paul's wife. His wife is apparently not traveling with him. There's not much mention of her. And in that same chapter of 1 Corinthians, he says, now to the unmarried and widows, I say it is good for them to stay unmarried as I am. So we know that Paul had to be married when he was in the Sanhedrin. And when he wrote 1 Corinthians, he was unmarried. So that just leaves all kinds of questions about what happened. No one really knows. And then Paul writes, don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us? But I have not used any of these rights.
Sounds like she's still there, but he hasn't taken it.
Well, is he married or isn't he? And is his wife still there or not? And, how is that affecting his judgment on the subject? And is that part of why he wrote those 3 verses in 1 Corinthians? So I guess the bottom line for me is that I don't think any of those 3 verses are applicable to my life.
Well, better you're glad that's.
I'm used to it.
I could give you some context. Again, this contextual. It's a dual. dual contextuality here. One is the Roman Empire, the ethos of the empire. The other is what Jay just mentioned, the apocalyptic. Apocalypse just means revelation. The apocalyptic event in Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. Really, the key is resurrection. That Paul and others, you could read 1 Corinthians or 1 Thessalonians, they're expecting to see Christ return
in their lifetime.
Oh yes, in fact, he says it. Yeah, in fact, he's trying to prepare them for this return,
Right.
as we're doing in Advent. But of course, it gets lengthened by the time you get to 1 Peter. A year is like 1,000 years for God now. So it's been delayed for 2,000 years for us. So that's the context in which we have to go back in time to recapture the sentiment in Paul in proper. So he's not actually anti-marriage, although it sounds like it on the surface. In fact, if anything, he's pro-creation, pro-space creation. And in Romans 8, clearly, he sees the entirety of creation longing for God's revelation of the children of God, that everything will be made new and right again, but groaning and with 5 student words, he says. So he has this worldview in which marriage is good, a blessing, and with a command, be fruitful and multiply. He knows this as a good Jew. He's not negating it or abandoning it. He's saying that time is now coming to an end. So the language in 1 Corinthians is time has grown short for us. So what do you do? So this is hypothetically, you could ask yourself, if you knew, or whatever, that the world would end in about, on January 2nd, how would you live your life between now and January 2nd? Well, I would find it kind of silly to keep contributing to my pension fund or whatever. I'd start to withdraw and go and enjoy stuff with my family and my wife in particular. Maybe I'm just making this up. In other words, I would probably change whatever I believed in for decades that I should do in the face of what I know now to be the reality. Paul had to change his entire life. You can't imagine this. Most people can't. He 180 degrees, and part of it is it has begun. The apocalypse has begun by Christ's resurrection. So, in that context, marriage has no value. Why? Because in the Roman Empire, well, more so in the Jewish tradition, the purpose of marriage is to become one flesh, which means to have offspring. Right? You have to have offspring. Well, what's an offspring? It's the procreation. What God said, keep making more. In fact, multiply. It's exponential, of course. Genesis knows that. So multiply. Well, why do you multiply if you're going to bring in babies into a world that's finished?
Changing, yeah.
So that's not part of the preparation. If I knew the world was going to end, I would say, hey, let's make as many babies as we can before. No, but you have to buy more diapers and all these other things. No, let's prepare in a way that's appropriate to our understanding of what preparation requires. For faith, preparation requires, of course, in the framework of the coming of Christ. It's not just the world will end. Woo, party time. No. Prayerful, awake is a watchword for Advent. Keep awake, keep alert. You'll maybe remember these texts from past Advents. Keep awake, keep alert. And you have to find faithfully, ethically, what that means in daily living. How do you live in an alert mode all your life as a Christian? Every Advent, for sure. Very hard. Another topic, another day. But anyway, so Paul is not arguing against marriage or women, but what he's arguing for in Corinth, because Corinth was a typical and maybe more than a typical Roman city where sexual activity was just like eating breakfast. Nothing. In fact, if you could imagine sexual activity in our world, imagine more in the Roman Empire. We have records of them. We have, in fact, pictures of them. And even including non-human beings. Okay? So we don't be too, there's an adult church class. So there's nothing new under the sun in terms of human pleasures and sexuality and sexual activity. What Paul is saying is that there's no point to the Jewish understanding of sex as for becoming one flesh, to woman and man becoming one flesh, a child. Chromosomally, anyway. Right? There's no point to that. So what should you do? Well, pray. What does he advise for people who are already married? He said, well, it's too bad you're already married. Because now you can't devote as much time. That's all in chapter 7. I'm not making it up. Check it out. Don't believe a word I tell you. He says, well, you can't devote as much time to preparation because you have to take care of your wife, take care of your husband. Of course you should. You're bound to. Legally, you're obliged to. So Paul says, all right, well then, at least carve out, schedule a time where you're apart. You're not having sexual relations. You're devoting time to prayer and study of God's will and so forth. The Torah and whatever else, right? Spiritual matters. Because that's how you keep alert and prepare for Christ's coming. It's like when a guest is coming, you prepare the room, right? You don't just hang out and do your normal thing. You clean up. You red up, as the Western Pennsylvania people say. You red up. You clean. You prepare. You buy food, whatever. Buy beverages. Set things right. We're doing that now at home. Because you have a family dinner tonight. So Paul says, stop having sex. There's no point to it. Yes, it's pleasurable. So when does he say, because he's also practical, he says, well, if you're so weak if you're so weak that you have to have sexual pleasures, then go ahead. Get married. It's a consent, a compromise that he provides because he knows how powerful sexual urges are. He says, if you have to have it, then go ahead and get married. But if you're married, sure, you have full rights as a man, anyway. Man can demand sex at any time from the woman. And you could divorce her if she's not compliant. By the way, in that world, if you're divorced, then you are really cast out. Unless you have a rich family, they'll take you back in. A woman without a man is just lower than it can be. So it's a concession. So if you're married, withdraw from sexual pleasures, focus on spiritual growth, if you will. True kind of growth in the Bible. If you're not married, don't even think about it. Unless you're so weak, he does use these words. If you're so weak that you have to have sexual pleasures, then go ahead and get married. Because you shouldn't do what the rest of the Roman Empire is doing, which is have sex with anybody you want. Anytime.
So why is this
that makes sense.
why is this in the canon then, if it's that culturally centered? I mean, that's a point in time when Paul thought that was the case. Why is it? What's its relevance in today's world?
The relevance and the canonization are related, but not the same. So this will take another few sessions by themselves. But canonization requires centuries. In fact, not until the end of the 4th century do we have the 27 list of 27 books as we have it in the order we have it, and that's in the Easter letter that Athanasius, the bishop of Alexandria, Egypt, wrote in 367. That's how late that. Earlier, we do have earlier canons, Marcion's canons, for instance, 2nd century, where you have few books. Some churches have just one gospel, maybe some letters. There are lots of canons out there for different churches. Well, bishops have to gather and compare notes, and Athanasius said, okay, enough of this. We need one canon for all the churches of all the cities. There were 5 main centers at the time: Jerusalem, Alexandria.
So why include this if they thought it was, by then they realized that the second coming wasn't that imminent?
So when the communities gathered, they said, well, what books should be included? So first is that they had to have a canon that they agreed on. That was the first step, because they all had different canons. Second is to say, okay, who gets to determine, well, the bishops, of course, have to meet. It's like Congress, right? Who gets to determine this? Well, the bishops. Representing all these cities, the heads of the churches. Bishop just means overseer. Bishop, anyway, episkopos, right? And they said, well, what are the things that we have found edifying or important for our faith communities? So they compared notes. So 2 books, at least 2, that didn't get included that maybe should have been by large consensus of scholarship and so on. Shepherd of Hermas, if you read it, you'll see there's nothing wrong in there. It's all great stuff. And also the Didache, and his teaching, right? Great stuff in there. Some of it in these books overlap with what you find in the New Testament. The reasons there are various. I don't have time to go through all of them, but one of the top ones that address your concern here is, did they maintain the church's faith through persecution? In other words, were these texts that were meaningful for, and were they meaningful for enough congregations, enough churches, enough jurisdictions that they should be considered? So if only 1 or 2 or 10 churches had it, but the hundreds of churches didn't have them, then it'd be a novelty. So they said that can't work. So what did the majority of churches have in common that sustained them through the harshest of the persecutions, including martyrdoms and persecution and death? And when they did that, they came up with these books that were meaningful for them in preparation. They were all expecting the Lord's return, of course. So for all the subsequent generations, these texts still spoke to them. And when they accrued to that level of about, by the time you get to the fifth century, then you have a pretty decent consensus. Not every church has the same canon, but that these books should be preserved and still used in worship and for doctrine. A lot of books were excluded, including what we might call now Gnostic texts, or Protestants would call pseudonymous, or pseudepigraphy, or the Apocrypha. Lots of books that many churches found very helpful, but not enough through enough time, enough generations, enough churches to make it into this final canon. That's kind of part of the answer to this question. How come these were put into the canon if they only had relevance for all the people through enough time? So that's why I said at one point, I think, to some of you anyway, if a book were to drop out of heaven with God's hand directing it and saying, this is my word for you, we can't include that in the canon because it didn't sustain any church through any time of persecution or through history. We have to reject God's burning book that lands here. Even if Jesus delivered it, we couldn't put that in the canon.
So what that, yeah, I mean,
what sustained the church through generations, and so this book did, and so it was included.
So what that boils down to, though, is that we're saying that the canon is a man-made thing and not inspired by God.
The canon is, historical emergence out of life.
So a lot of us, a lot of people in the church believe that every word of Scripture has to be taken verbatim.
Well, that's a different issue. So,
and which we don't have time to dive any deeper in this.
Not shave off anything from the authority and the absolute authority of the Church of Scriptures. Just because there are parts that are obsolete or irrelevant to us today does not mean the canon itself. Right? This is what Jefferson did. The mistake he made was he ripped out every page that was supernatural because this is obsolete. We're rational beings now in the Enlightenment. We don't need these things. We just need the ethical teachings. So his Bible is very thick, out of 10, and I have a copy of it. It's wonderful. It's what German scholarship did in the 19th century. But that's not the canon. That's Jefferson's canon, but it's not the canon of the church.
It makes me think, Jay, that a lot of this from Paul supports celibacy.
Right.
So Roman Catholics were in charge of Christianity in the world. That's why it was included.
Well, that's part of the reason for celibacy.
Okay, we don't have time to dive into this. It's already 12 o'clock. What else do I have here that I don't want to miss? Okay, we talked about Paul's wife. I mentioned this already, but there's a 9-year difference between when he wrote those verses in 1 Corinthians and when he wrote Ephesians. And so what's in Ephesians probably reflects a more mature understanding of what's going on. He's probably backed off of some of that. It's going to happen any minute. And there are two themes that the passage weaves together. There's the relationship between men and women, and there's the relationship between Christ and the church. And they're both important to the passage. Which of them do you think was his main point? Why do you say that?
Because he says what I'm really talking about is
exactly
that verse Paul we read. Yeah.
That's exactly right. So that's the thing we don't want to lose sight of here. He's talking about the relationship of Christ and the church in this passage. And we can't help ourselves from diving into this relationship between men and women when we read these verses. Okay, but that's really not what he's getting after. Normally, when a writer uses a simile like this, we expect one to be very clear and the other to help to be there for the simple purpose of explaining it. But in this case, they're interwoven, and each relationship helps us understand the other relationship. We can't really say which is the primary theme, but let's look at some concepts that he has in there about those relationships. Worsby says it has nothing to do with the order of authority. It governs the operation of authority. Jesus tried to teach his disciples not to throw their weight around. When Jesus washed their feet, he taught them that the greatest is the person who uses authority to build people up. By nature, we want to promote ourselves, but the Spirit enables us to submit ourselves. Christian marriage involves mutual submission, subordinating our personal desires for the good of the loved one, submitting ourselves to Christ as Lord. So husbands are called to love their wives just as Christ loved the church. The phrase gave himself up in there indicates a sacrificial surrendering. Christ sacrificed himself for the church because he loved it. Couples should be ready to make whatever sacrifices are necessary for their spouses. Marriage is a holy union, a living symbol, a precious relationship, and it needs tender, self-sacrificing care. So how should married couples love each other? They should be willing to sacrifice for one another. They should make each other's well-being of primary importance. They should care for the other as they care for their own body. And why did Paul tell wives to submit and husbands to love? Perhaps Christian women newly freed in Christ found submission difficult. Perhaps Christian men used the Roman custom of giving unlimited power to the head of the family. Were not used to treating their wives with respect and love at all.
Yeah.
So both husbands and wives should submit to each other, just as both should love each other. Submission reaffirms the new covenant of equality, as well as the affirmation of marriage, and partners voluntarily and joyously submit to one another.